A story full of unexpected twists forces one to ponder the fragility of human relationships and how quickly our lives can change. This tale of a man whose reality turned to ashes overnight begins at a moment when he seemingly stood on the threshold of a happy future. But fate had other plans, leaving him utterly bewildered and heartbroken. At the center of this story is a woman named Margot, who captivated the protagonist's heart at first sight. She possessed a rare gift, the ability to make him feel like the most important person in the world. Her infectious laughter at his clumsy jokes, her tender touches during walks, all seemed like expressions of genuine love. For 4 years, he believed he had found his soulmate, that their union was indestructible and eternal. Their wedding, planned for just a few weeks away, was a symbol of their love and the beginning of a new chapter in their life together. They chose the venue, debated decor details, and discussed whether to have an open bar. These sweet disagreements seemed normal for a couple preparing for marriage. However, looking back, the protagonist realizes he missed the warning signs. Margot became more distant, withdrawn. She smiled more often while looking at her phone, but didn't share those messages with him. He attributed it to pre-wedding stress, unwilling to believe their happiness could be at risk. What happened next, and what secrets was Margot hiding? The answers to these questions would soon be revealed. One evening, as if casually, she mentioned a small gathering with friends, a low-key bachelorette party, something light and informal, just a chance to enjoy time away from home. Her words sounded so ordinary, as if it were the most natural event in the world. The protagonist remembers watching her get ready that night, sitting on the edge of the bed as she primped in front of the mirror. She looked stunning. Her hair was artfully styled, and her dress perfectly accentuated her figure. Yet there was a falseness to the scene. Noticing his gaze, she smirked slightly and said, "What? You're looking at me like I've never left the house before." He forced a laugh, trying to hide his confusion. "You look amazing," he managed. She quickly pecked him on the lips goodbye and said, "Don't wait up for me." He tried to convince himself that everything was fine, that she deserved this evening out, that his worry was unfounded, but her phrase, "Don't wait up for me," echoed in his mind, giving him no peace. Sleep never came that night. He tossed and turned, his mind plunging into dark thoughts, into those corners of his consciousness he never wished to explore. When Margot still hadn't returned by 3 a.m, he did something he thought he'd never do. He checked her geolocation. What he saw made his heart painfully clench. She wasn't at a restaurant or a friend's apartment. Her location pointed to a private residence on the other side of town, one she had never mentioned before. He froze, staring at the screen, his hand trembling. His mind desperately tried to find excuses. Maybe one of her friends lived there. Maybe they just decided to move the party. But deep down, he already knew the bitter truth. Still, he waited, as the timid rays of the rising sun seeped through the blinds. She finally stepped through the door, the lightness of her steps, as if fearing to break the silence, betrayed a desire to remain unnoticed, though he, immersed in a whirlpool of dark suspicions, had not closed his eyes all night. An unfamiliar scent, alien to her usual perfumes and natural freshness, enveloped her. An unspoken question stuck in his throat. Without uttering a word, he continued to stare motionless at the ceiling, feeling something fragile inside him crack. with no single piece of evidence, no slightest confirmation of his fears. He was guided only by intuition, which told him that the woman he was about to marry had committed a betrayal whose magnitude he could not even imagine. In that tragic moment, he realized that the scales had fallen from his eyes forever. The sounds of her movements around the apartment, every rustle and sigh, echoed in his head, giving birth to thoughts he desperately tried to banish. The clatter of heels dropped by the door, the rustle of fabric as she changed clothes, a tired sigh escaping her lips as she sank onto the bed beside him. All seemed like an ominous premonition. Likely confident in his sound sleep, she did not utter a word, no quiet apology, no attempt at explanation, just oppressive silence, but sleep was far from him. His body was numb, his breathing remained even, but his heart pounded wildly in his chest. All night he fought with intrusive thoughts, convincing himself he was overly suspicious, that there was a logical explanation for her absence from a place she had never mentioned, for his own short-sightedness that had prompted him to check. But her stealthy gait, like a thief aware of her guilt and trying to hide traces of her crime, shattered his last illusions. He felt the warmth of her body, but for the first time since they met, she seemed utterly alien to him. He desperately wanted to jump up, turn on the light, and demand the truth, but fear paralyzed him. Fear of her words, of what he might hear, of the realization that the life they had built together, the future he had meticulously planned, had already collapsed, and he was simply not yet ready to admit it. And so he chose to wait. The next morning, dawn broke before she did, as she stirred with a sleepy sigh, leaving the embrace of Morpheus. He heard her footsteps heading to the bathroom, the sound of water running from the shower, and a quiet hum, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't returned with the first rays of sunlight from places unknown to him. Gathering his strength, he got up and went to the kitchen to make coffee, but his hands trembled betrayingly. When she finally appeared, wrapped in a towel with wet hair, her face lit up with a smile, as if nothing had happened. "Good morning," she said, leaning in for a fleeting kiss. He allowed it, even though every fiber of his being screamed that something was wrong. "You came back late," he carefully remarked, watching her reaction intently. In response, she merely yawned and stretched. "Yeah, the girls wanted to keep the party going, so we went to Kelly's cousin's. I wanted to text you, but I thought you were asleep." He studied her intently, how she avoided his gaze, how she casually mentioned a name he had never heard before, how effortlessly she lied. And then he knew. He had no details, no confession, no proof, but he knew, slowly nodding, he pretended to believe her. "Yeah, I fell asleep early," he replied, taking a sip of coffee that suddenly tasted bitter. "Glad you had a good time." She beamed, walking past him to get dressed, unaware that everything connecting them was crumbling in his mind. The rest of the day passed in a blur. He acted on autopilot, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, while inside him a hurricane raged. He frantically replayed all their recent conversations, trying to find the subtle signs he had missed, her delays, her sudden desire for solitude, her new habit of blocking her phone. Finally, the decision solidified. He needed to get to the truth, however painful it might be. Late at night, when Margot had fallen asleep, he decided to take her phone. His fingers trembled betrayingly as he entered the password. Fortunately, she hadn't changed it. His heart pounded wildly as he scrolled through messages, hoping to find something that would disprove his suspicions. But no miracle happened. First, he found a group chat with her so-called friends. However, there were other participants, unfamiliar names that made his stomach twist. Last night was just crazy. Can't believe we finally talked her into coming. She was shy at first, but quickly warmed up. I told you she'd like it. Do you think she'll come next time? Nausea rose in his throat. His vision blurred as he opened the attached photos. The pictures weren't explicit, but it was enough. Margot in an unfamiliar house, surrounded by unfamiliar people, with a glass in her hand, laughing and looking happier than he had seen her in weeks. Gritting his teeth, he continued to scroll, his breathing quickened. And then he found the worst, a personal message. Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about it. You're something special. The message was from an unknown number. And her reply, "You're trouble, but I had fun." He placed the phone on the nightstand, almost dropping it from his trembling hands. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, threatening to make him faint. Suddenly, the air seemed to leave the room, leaving only a suffocating emptiness. What had happened was not just a fleeting mistake or a thoughtless act committed while intoxicated. No, it was a carefully planned and conscious decision on her part, and the most monstrous thing was that after all this, she returned to his house, gave him a meaningless kiss, and fell asleep beside him. As if he were nothing to her, he sat, fingers white-knuckled, gripping the edge of the bed, his mind torn by conflicting emotions, fury, unbearable pain, disbelief at what was happening. But one thing became clear. The woman he was about to marry was not who she pretended to be, and their wedding was never going to happen. The sleepless night dragged on excruciatingly long. Messages, photos, her smug smirk in her texts, which felt like a painful slap, continuously replayed in his head. He lay, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady breathing of the woman sleeping beside him, and wondered how she could sleep so peacefully while his world was falling apart. He wanted to wake her up, demand immediate explanations, force her to confess everything. But what would that change? She would surely lie, try to convince him of his own inadequacy, make him look crazy for even asking. He had seen this before, heard stories from other men who had been in similar situations, but he never imagined he would become one of them. With the first rays of sun, a strange, deceptive sense of clarity dawned in his soul. Margot, like an actress, continued to play her usual morning scene, unaware that the veil of secrecy had been torn. A light kiss on the cheek, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, a quick glance at her phone screen. Perhaps there she was exchanging messages with her accomplices, those who helped her weave a web of lies behind the protagonist's back. He watched her every gesture, trying to discern the slightest sign of remorse, a shadow of guilt, but there wasn't a single crack in her behavior. "By the way," she casually remarked, glancing at him, "we still need to finalize the wedding guest list." These words, like a punch to the gut, knocked the air out of his lungs. The wedding? A ceremony that would never happen. A ceremony she continued to hypocritically plan, while her heart belonged to another. Gathering the last remnants of self-control, he forced a semblance of a smile and nodded in agreement. In that moment, he realized he couldn't just end this story with a loud scene. He needed to disappear, vanish into thin air, so that his disappearance would be a complete surprise to her, just as her betrayal had stunned him. Let her experience shock, confusion, overwhelming emptiness. Let her wake up one beautiful morning, anticipating her wedding day, and discover only ringing silence. But first, he had to make sure she didn't suspect his true intentions for a second. For the rest of the day, the man tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. In conversations, he mechanically nodded when wedding preparations, dress fittings, and floral arrangements were mentioned, as if these matters still held meaning for him. He even agreed to have dinner with her parents the upcoming weekend. However, deep down, an escape plan was brewing. As soon as the woman left for work, he began to execute his plan. First, he called John, his best friend, and the only person he could fully trust. When he shared what he had learned, a tense silence hung on the other end of the line. "Damn it," John finally said. "Are you sure you don't want to talk to her?" The man shook his head negatively, though his friend couldn't see it. "No, she'll start lying and twist everything around. I don't need that drama, John. I just want to disappear." A heavy sigh followed. "Okay, buddy, how can I help?" "Help me disappear." Thus began the planning of his disappearance. He began to act methodically, collecting only the essentials, his passport, a few changes of clothes, important documents he didn't want her to have access to. He transferred all his savings to a new bank account, making sure she couldn't claim a cent. Then he terminated the lease for their shared apartment, sending notice to the landlord only in his name, so it would be a complete surprise for her. After that, he began to write a letter. It took him several hours to find the right words, to express to her exactly what she had done, without raising his voice. In the end, he wrote the following. "Margot, I know. I know about the party. I know about the messages on your phone. I know about the man you spent the night with while I was home, thinking we were building a life together. I know everything. I'm not going to waste time asking why. It doesn't matter anymore. I just want you to know that I now see you for who you truly are. There will be no wedding by the time you read this letter. I will be gone. I hope what you were looking for that night was worth it. Don't try to find me." He signed the letter, folded it neatly, and left it on the kitchen table, where she would surely see it as soon as she returned home. Then, without looking back, he walked out the door, without taking a single thing that could remind him of her. He didn't allow himself time to grieve for a lost life, because, in truth, that life never existed. It was all just an illusion, built on lies. As he left the city, leaving behind the familiar apartment and the woman with whom he had once dreamed of growing old, an unexpected feeling washed over him. Relief. For the first time in a long time, he felt a breath of freedom, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The most surprising thing about the decision to disappear was its seeming simplicity. Public opinion often paints a picture requiring meticulous planning, months of preparation, and the creation of an entirely new identity. However, in reality, it boils down to simply leaving and refusing to look back. As he drove further from the city, he kept expecting regret, some irresistible impulse to turn around and beg Margot for a coherent explanation. But the further he drove, the clearer he realized there was nothing to save. What words could she choose? Claim it was an unfortunate mistake? Assert that what happened meant nothing? Messages, photos, Lines filled with excitement and flirtation, without a hint of guilt or doubt, flashed before his eyes. No, he didn't need an explanation. He desperately needed distance. John provided him with temporary refuge, a modest cabin in the wilderness, located a few hours' drive from the city. It belonged to his uncle, who used it only during hunting season. It was exactly what he needed. No internet, no extra noise, and no reminders of the chaos his life had become. Just him, the ringing silence, and a stack of books he hadn't touched in ages. Turning onto the gravel road, he let out a long breath that he realized he had been holding in all this time. The cabin, despite its modest size, looked sturdy and reliable, hidden in the shadow of dense pine trees, exuding the scent of rain. Getting out of the car, he stretched his aching legs, feeling the weight of the last few days deeply embedded in his bones. Inside was simple, wooden floors, a massive stone fireplace, and furniture that seemed frozen in time from the early 90s. But he didn't care. He hadn't come here for comfort and convenience. He came to figure himself out and understand what the hell he was supposed to do next. The first few hours after realizing what had happened passed in fruitless attempts to grasp reality, staring out the window. What was happening seemed unimaginable. Wedding invitations had already been sent. Relatives were anticipating the celebration, dreaming of a happy future for the young couple, of a life two people had sworn to build together. But while the protagonist indulged in dreams of eternal love, Margot was secretly seeking adventures on the side. What was it? A thirst for thrills, or an attempt to experience feelings that the protagonist, in her opinion, couldn't give her? He dismissed the thought, realizing it no longer mattered and wouldn't change anything. The vibration of his phone snapped him out of his stupor. It was a message from John with a terse question. "Did you leave?" After a moment's hesitation, the protagonist typed a short reply. "Yes, I left." A moment later, another message arrived. "Are you okay?" This question was harder. Could he say he was okay? The protagonist wasn't sure. No words could describe the state of numbness he felt. He chose not to reply, simply turning off his phone and tossing it onto the coffee table. The subsequent days blurred into a silent haze. The protagonist woke up late and spent hours sitting outside, letting the sun warm his face, while his mind was torn between anger and an overwhelming emptiness. He tried not to think about Margot, but her image, like a persistent ghost, haunted his mind. Her laugh, her voice, her gaze, which she had given him just days ago. As if nothing had happened, the protagonist tortured himself with the question of when she discovered his letter. Did she read it with horror and guilt, or did she just scoff and shrug, already planning her next escape? He wondered if she tried to contact him, if she asked friends about his sudden disappearance. However, he would never know the answer, as his phone remained turned off. Suddenly, on the fourth day, John appeared, holding a pack of cold drinks in one hand and a bag of prepared food in the other. "Thought you could use some beer," he declared, entering the house like he owned the place. "And some real food. You look terrible." A light chuckle escaped the protagonist's lips, the first genuine sound in days. "Thanks," he replied, "and I feel just as bad." They settled on the porch, silently consuming their drinks, interrupted only by the melodic rustle of wind in the leaves of the trees. "Have you ever thought about your next steps?" John broke the prolonged silence. The protagonist slowly exhaled, gazing into the distance. "Not really." Right now, I'm just trying to find a way to live without feeling like my whole life was built on a lie." John nodded understandingly, taking a sip of his beer. A long pause followed, for which the protagonist was genuinely grateful. He didn't need advice or reassurances. He just needed time to get through this period, to let the dust settle before making any decisions about the future. One thing was absolutely clear. There would be no turning back to the past. The first few days after the protagonist's sudden disappearance were shrouded in a veil of unreality, as if he had found himself in an alternate version of his life, where familiar landmarks had lost all meaning. The ringing silence of the secluded cabin became both a salvation and a heavy burden for him. On one hand, it granted much-needed space for deep reflection, but on the other, it mercilessly sharpened the sense of reality of what was happening. The absence of familiar city bustle, daily noise, and the senseless routine of wedding preparations only intensified the oppressive weight of what he had endured. Every moment was permeated by an all-consuming mixture of rage, bewilderment, and a feeling the protagonist stubbornly refused to acknowledge: grief. For long years he had built a life with Margot, naively believing he had found the one with whom he would grow old, hand in hand. Now, this carefully constructed version of the future was rudely and humiliatingly destroyed. It was not just a relationship collapse, but the bitter realization that the closest and most trusted person had been playing a double game right under his nose. The betrayal was not only in the act of infidelity itself, but also in the ease with which Margot lied, looked him in the eye daily, and convinced him of her love. Quite likely, she was now in a panic, agonizingly pondering the reasons for his disappearance. Since leaving, the protagonist had not once turned on his phone, not wanting to see her name on the screen, hear excuses, false apologies, or desperate attempts to present the situation in a favorable light. He had made his choice, putting an end to their relationship. However, this did not mean Margot was ready to simply accept the breakup. The protagonist foresaw her inevitable arrival, and his premonitions did not deceive him. On the 6th morning of his voluntary digital seclusion, his resolve crumbled under the pressure of practical necessity. Not consumed by idle curiosity, he was compelled to access his mobile device to verify the security of his finances. However, no sooner had the screen come to life than he was hit by a barrage of missed calls, voicemails, and text messages, the lion's share of which came from Margot. With each line of desperate messages, such as, "Where are you? What's happening? Come back. We need to talk. I need to see you. This is ridiculous. You're overreacting. Just let me know you're safe." His insides tightened into a knot. The tone of her messages evolved from panicked to pleading, and then gradually shifted to disappointment. The latest messages were concise and cold. "You're being foolish. If you're going to run away like a coward, maybe it's for the best for everyone." Gritting his teeth, he gripped the phone tighter. There she was, the true Margot, unable to accept losing control of the situation. He ignored her messages, not even bothering to listen to the voicemails. Putting the phone down, he slowly exhaled. There was no remorse in her words, only annoyance that he had left her before she could manipulate him into staying. He was plagued by doubts, how long she intended to remain silent, or if she had planned to reveal the truth at all. Was she going to walk down the aisle, hypocritically pretending everything was fine? Could she face their loved ones and utter false vows? The mere thought of it made him sick. When John reappeared on the doorstep, the protagonist had already made a firm decision. Not a single thought about her would occupy his mind again. Driving his truck to his humble abode, John carried 2 bags full of provisions. "Thought you were probably on a canned soup diet by now," he said with a smirk, placing the bags on the kitchen table. The protagonist merely snorted, admitting his friend wasn't far off the mark. John, without wasting time, pulled a bottle of amber liquid from the fridge, opened it, and, leaning against the table, asked, "So, are you going to tell me your plans, or are you going to become a mountain hermit forever?" The protagonist, with a heavy sigh, ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he confessed. "It feels like if I go back, I'll have to face all of it. The questions, the drama, the sympathetic glances of people feeling sorry for me." John nodded understandingly, agreeing with his fears, but immediately added, "But you can't hide here forever." And the protagonist knew his friend was right. As much as he wanted to stay in seclusion, avoid all this mess, he couldn't let Margot's betrayal paralyze his life. He needed to find a way to move forward, even if he had no idea where to start. John, studying his face intently, put down his unfinished beer. "Listen, buddy," he said. "I know you won't like this, but she probably won't leave you alone. She's not the type to give up easily." The protagonist smirked, confirming his words. "Yeah, I got that impression." "Are you going to answer her?" John inquired. In response, the protagonist merely shook his head. "No, nothing left to say." John shrugged. "Well, suit yourself, but knowing her, she's probably already figuring out how to twist everything to make herself the victim." The protagonist involuntarily recalled Margot's last message, in which she accused him of cowardice, acting as if he had betrayed her. It even seemed funny how quickly she had changed roles. Almost funny. He exhaled, gazing out the window, watching the trees sway in the wind. "I just need to figure out what to do next," he murmured. John reassuringly clapped him on the shoulder. "Then, let's figure it out together." And for the first time since his escape to the mountains, a glimmer of hope dawned in the protagonist's soul, that it truly was possible. The next morning, awakening brought with it a surprising sense of enlightenment. The world hadn't quite arrived yet, but it was the closest he'd felt in days. The rage hadn't disappeared. It still smoldered beneath the surface. However, it was no longer the all-consuming anger that clouded his mind. Now it was focused, sharp, and cold, fueling further action instead of paralyzing his will. Margot hadn't stopped trying to reach him. He knew this even before he activated his phone. Checking messages became a kind of ritual to confirm nothing had changed, that she was still desperately trying to control the situation. No answer came, nor was one anticipated, but one phrase from her last message resonated deeply. "If you're going to run away like a coward, maybe it's for the best." He barely suppressed a laugh when he read this. Coward? She was the one who committed the betrayal, destroying everything connecting them for fleeting infatuations. And yet, in her mind, he was guilty simply because he didn't let her convince him otherwise. It was this kind of logic that made him realize how little he truly knew about this woman. The protagonist spent the day meticulously cleaning his humble's dwelling, striving to regain a lost sense of control over his own life. John had left the cabin at dawn, promising to keep in touch, but the need for communication was absent. A plan was forming in his mind, clear and concrete, a beacon pointing the way forward. The primary task was to irrevocably remove Margot from his destiny. Settling at a simple wooden table, the protagonist opened his laptop and began to meticulously analyze all the threads connecting him to his ex-fiancée, shared bank accounts, joint subscriptions, and other ties binding their lives. Systematically and methodically, he severed these connections. Funds were transferred to his personal account, and his name was excluded from the lease agreement, which, fortunately, had always been solely tied to his credit history. Every measure was taken to deprive Margot of legal ways to contact him. As he worked, images of her reaction arose in his imagination. He pictured her checking her banking app and finding a zero balance, her calling the landlord, bewildered why she suddenly had to handle everything alone. Would she be overcome with anger? Would she burst into tears? Or would she simply not care? The last thought stung him more than he was willing to admit. He wanted her to be affected by what happened, but not out of a desire to get her back. God forbid. No, but out of a desire for her to feel the full weight of her actions. However, this was no longer his concern. By the end of the day, all planned tasks were completed. Now he had to consider what his future held. A prestigious job remained in the city, and formally, there was always a possibility of returning. However, the thought of returning to the same streets, the same neighborhoods where he once built a life with Margot, evoked only repulsion. Wherever he looked, everything would serve as a painful reminder. Every familiar face would prompt unnecessary questions, sympathetic glances, unwanted conversations. It was unbearable, at least for now. And then a decision was made. He reached for his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and found a number he hadn't called in years. Only 2 rings passed before a low, familiar voice answered. "Didn't expect a call from you," he said. The protagonist exhaled loudly, running a hand through his hair. "Hi, Dad." A short pause followed. "Are you okay?" A simple question, but something in his tone, the way he understood something serious had happened, even before a word was spoken, almost broke him. He swallowed hard. Not really. Another pause, and then, without the slightest hesitation, the reply came. "Come home." And just like that, the next step was decided. That memorable night, the protagonist gathered his belongings, feeling a strange sensation as he packed all his possessions into one duffel bag. This made him think about how little he actually needed to live. Just a few changes of clothes, a laptop, and essentials. Everything else seemed unnecessary and was left behind. The long road home to his hometown stretched for many miles on the open highway. The sky gradually darkened as he moved away from his old life. He hadn't visited his hometown in many years, not since his mother's passing. His relationship with his father had always been reserved and not particularly close. His father was a quiet man of few words, who expressed his love through actions rather than words. Leaving for the big city, the protagonist never expected to return. However, given the circumstances, he had nowhere else to go. When he finally drove up to the familiar house, light pouring from the window illuminated the old wooden steps of the porch. This sight evoked mixed feelings, nostalgia, relief, and something akin to sadness. The front door opened before he could even get out of the car. His father stood on the doorstep, arms crossed, looking at him with an unreadable expression. He looked older than the protagonist remembered. The wrinkles on his face were deeper, and there was more grey in his hair. Getting out of the car, he said quietly, "Hi." His father nodded silently and stepped aside, inviting him in. The house smelled of old wood, coffee, and something subtly familiar that was hard to describe. Placing his bag in the hallway, the protagonist suddenly felt like a stranger in this house where he had spent his childhood. His father silently pointed to the kitchen and asked, "Hungry?" The protagonist barely suppressed a smile, realizing this was his father's first question. Not, "What happened?" or "How are you?" but just a quiet, unspoken offer of comfort in the only way he knew how. "Yes," he replied. His father nodded and headed to the stove, saying, "Good, sit down." Sitting at the table, the protagonist felt for the first time in days that he was not alone. Once inside his childhood home, the protagonist felt as if he had encountered a ghost of his past self, that version he thought he had buried under the weight of years. The old wooden kitchen table, a witness to his childhood, bore scratches and dents on its surface, silent narratives of a time before Margot, and the bitter experience of betrayal. His father, with his usual quiet efficiency, moved about the kitchen, working with a frying pan, cracking eggs, and flipping slices of bacon. He didn't rush with questions, giving his son a chance to break the silence when he was ready. The long-awaited words finally escaped the protagonist's lips. "She cheated on me," he mumbled, not taking his eyes off the intricate wood grain. "That's why I left." His father paused for a moment, but showed no surprise, only slowly exhaled, transferring the cooked bacon to a plate. "Yes," he said, placing it in front of his son. "I suspected something like that." The protagonist frowned, looking at him questioningly. "What do you mean?" His father shrugged, sitting down opposite him with his own plate. "You sounded different on the phone. And I know you. You wouldn't just leave without a good reason." The son took a fork, hesitantly stirring his scrambled eggs. "I had a choice," he mumbled. "I could have stayed, could have talked to her, could have listened to her explanations. Would that have changed anything?" The question followed, the protagonist's jaw clenched in a silent reply. "No." "Then you did the right thing," his father concluded. A bitter laugh escaped the son. "Doesn't feel like it at all." His father slowly, thoughtfully chewed his food. "Not yet," he admitted, "but it will, in time." The protagonist wasn't sure he shared that confidence. After that, they ate in silence, broken only by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clinking of cutlery. Surprisingly, this setting felt quite normal, as if he hadn't abandoned his old life, as if he hadn't left behind the woman who was once everything to him. When the meal was done, his father rose and took 2 bottles of amber liquid from the fridge, offering one across the table to his son. With an inviting gesture towards the back porch, he suggested, "Come on, let's sit outside for a bit." The son followed him, stepping into the warm night. The backyard seemed smaller than he remembered, but the old oak tree still stood majestically in the corner, its branches spreading out as they had in his childhood. They settled into the worn wooden chairs, the same ones that seemed to have been there forever. His father opened his bottle, took a sip, then leaned back, gazing at the sky. After a long pause, he broke the silence. "You know, your mother and I had our challenges too." The son blinked, caught off guard by the revelation. His father never spoke of his mother like that, especially after her passing. "What do you mean?" he cautiously inquired, his father exhaled, rolling the cool bottle in his hands. She never cheated, but there were tough times in our marriage. Marriage isn't always what it's idealized to be. Sometimes you wake up next to someone and realize you don't know them at all. The son swallowed hard. That's exactly the feeling that had haunted him during his last days with Margot, as if she had become a stranger in his own home. Were there times when her actions made you doubt her? He asked. His father shook his head. No, but that's not the point. People show you who they truly are when they think no one is watching. You just have to decide whether to trust them or not. The son stared at his beer, his father's words slowly sinking in. She showed you who she is, son, his father simply said, and you believed her. The son had no reply. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the shimmering stars, the weight of what he had endured pressing down on his shoulders. For the first time since leaving home, he felt something shift inside, as if he had stopped merely running from problems and started moving forward. The next morning, awakening brought with it an unusual feeling of lightness, as if the burden of the past few weeks had suddenly lifted. Of course, the problems hadn't disappeared by magic, but for the first time since his familiar world collapsed, the protagonist no longer felt like he was drowning in despair. He stepped out onto the porch, where the fresh morning air was filled with the scents of pine needles and freshly cut grass. His father, as usual, was already there with his ever-present mug of coffee, as if transported from distant childhood memories. His father didn't say a word as his son joined him. For a long time, they just silently watched the sun rise over the backyard. Finally, the silence was broken by a simple, yet profoundly important question. Well, what's next? This was the question the protagonist had carefully avoided, for which he felt completely unprepared. But at that moment, fear receded. I don't know, he honestly admitted, but I think that's okay. His father merely nodded approvingly, taking a sip of coffee. Yes, it is. Images of his past life flashed through his mind, the apartment he would never return to, the wedding that never happened, the woman who once seemed destined for him. All of it was now in the past, but surprisingly, it no longer evoked a sense of loss, but rather felt like long-awaited freedom. The protagonist turned to his father and said, I think I want to stay here for a while. A faint smile touched the corner of his father's lips. I thought so. It was at this moment that he realized the decision was right. No more running, no more feeling lost. The protagonist was exactly where he was supposed to be.